There is a room in Winchester. The year is 1141. The walls are cold stone. The light comes in sideways through a slit window, thin and gray like a January afternoon. A woman sits at its center, not resting, not waiting, watching. And she is not supposed to be there. Her name is Matilda. She is the daughter of Henry I of England, the only surviving legitimate child he left behind. He had made his barons swear, more than once, that she would inherit his throne. And yet, the moment he died, a man took it anyway. Her cousin, Stephen of Blois, rode to London while Matilda was still on the continent and had himself crowned before anyone could object. This is the world Matilda was born into, a world where a woman's claim, even a sworn, legal, documented claim, could vanish the moment a man decided to move faster. Matilda spent years fighting. She crossed the Channel, she raised armies, she negotiated alliances, she was captured and escaped. In April of 1141, after Stephen was taken prisoner at the Battle of Lincoln, she was recognized as Domina Anglorum, Lady of the English, making her the first woman to be so recognized in England's history. But she was never formally crowned. The Londoners revolted. She fled. And eventually, the war ground on without a clear winner. She never wore the crown. But her son did. Henry II. The entire Plantagenet line, the most powerful dynasty in medieval England, ran through her. She had fought not for herself alone. She had fought to make something possible. 400 years pass. England is a different country now, larger in ambition, tangled in religion, and ruled by a dynasty that never quite settled its own succession. When Edward VI died in 1553, a teenager on a throne he had barely warmed, England held its breath. The crown went next to his half-sister Mary. She was 37 years old, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and she had been waiting for this moment through decades of humiliation. Her parents' marriage had been annulled. She had been declared illegitimate. She had been stripped of her title, her household, her proximity to power. She had survived it all. Mary I was the first queen regnant of England. Not a queen consort, not a wife to a king, but a ruling monarch in her own right. That distinction mattered enormously. She governed, she signed documents, she commanded armies, and she spent her reign trying to return England to the Catholic faith her mother had raised her in. She married Philip II of Spain. She reversed the Protestant reforms of her father and brother. She had nearly 300 Protestants burned at the stake, which is why history handed her the name Bloody Mary. What history tends to mention less is that her father had people executed for their faith too, and no one named him for it. She died in 1558, possibly of uterine or ovarian cancer. She had experienced at least 2 phantom pregnancies, her body convincing her she carried an heir she never had. She died without a child, without the legacy she'd built her reign toward. And she died, knowing that her Protestant half-sister would undo everything she had spent 5 years constructing. That half-sister was Elizabeth. Elizabeth I was 25 years old when she rode into London in November 1558. The crowds lined the streets. People wept. She was tall, pale, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's red hair. She had spent years in the shadow of potential execution. She had been imprisoned in the Tower while her sister reigned, suspected of plotting, questioned, watched. She had learned to say nothing that could be used against her. She had learned to survive. Her coronation gown was gold. Her procession through the city lasted hours. She stopped to receive gifts, to speak with ordinary Londoners, to hold in her hands the English Bible offered to her by a child. She pressed it to her chest. The gesture was deliberate. Everything Elizabeth did was deliberate. She never married. This was the single most discussed, most analyzed, most politically loaded decision of her 45-year reign. Parliament begged her to name an heir. Ambassadors from across Europe proposed. She deflected, delayed, charmed, and refused. Was she protecting herself from the vulnerability of pregnancy? Was she unwilling to cede power to a husband? Was there someone she truly loved but could not marry? Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, was at her side for decades. What we know is that she understood something precise. The moment she named a husband, she halved her power. She had watched her sister be overshadowed by Philip of Spain. She had watched her mother be discarded. She chose a different kind of sovereignty. She called herself the Virgin Queen. She built a cult of image around that identity. White face, elaborate ruffs, hair dressed in jewels. The portraits were not documentation, they were propaganda. She was performing monarchy, and she was brilliant at it. When the Spanish Armada sailed toward England in 1588, she rode to Tilbury and addressed her troops. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king." She knew what she was doing with those words. She was speaking the language of power that her audience understood, and then insisting she possessed it. England under Elizabeth was not peaceful. Ireland was under brutal subjugation. The poor starved in a series of harvest failures. The court was a place of constant competition and occasional execution. But the arts flourished. Shakespeare wrote during her reign. The English language became something extraordinary. And Elizabeth, cautious, intelligent, vain, lonely, and magnificently stubborn, sat at the center of it all. She died in March 1603, in her 70th year, in a palace at Richmond, reportedly unwilling to go to bed because she feared she might not wake. She sat on cushions on the floor for days. When she finally lost consciousness, her counselors crept from the room and sent word north to James VI of Scotland. The Tudor line ended not with a daughter, but with its refusal to produce one more. The Stuart century gave England two more queens regnant, both far less celebrated than they deserved to be. Mary II came to the throne in 1689 in one of the strangest events in English constitutional history. Her father, James II, had been ousted in the Glorious Revolution, effectively removed by Parliament, which then invited his Protestant daughter and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, to rule jointly. Mary insisted on that word, jointly. She would not accept being merely a figurehead for her husband's rule. She was queen. He was king. They would govern together. William III was often away, at war in Ireland, in the Netherlands, managing his European campaigns. In his absence, Mary governed England alone. She handled the Privy Council. She oversaw military correspondence. She made decisions. She was, by all accounts, composed in public and privately anxious, maintaining a careful dignity while ruling a country that was still absorbing the violence of a recent revolution. She died of smallpox in 1694. She was 32 years old. William, who had not always been easy to live with, reportedly wept without stopping. He never remarried. Then came Anne. Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, inherited the throne in 1702. She was a different kind of queen, not a warrior, not a political strategist in Elizabeth's mode, but a woman who governed through relationships, personal loyalty, and an extraordinary sense of duty. She was almost constantly pregnant throughout her adult life. 17 pregnancies. 17. Only 5 children were born alive, and none of them survived childhood. Her son William, Duke of Gloucester, was the last, dying at 11 years old. Anne continued governing. She presided over the War of the Spanish Succession. She navigated the bitter rivalry between the Duchess of Marlborough and her new favorite, Abigail Masham. She oversaw perhaps the most significant constitutional event of her reign, the Acts of Union of 1707, which joined England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain. Anne died in 1714, likely of gout and the accumulated physical toll of so many pregnancies. She was 49. She left no heir. The crown passed to a German prince, George I, because the alternative was a Catholic claimant, and Parliament had decided that mattered more than proximity of blood. More than a century passes before another woman sits on the British throne. Victoria arrives in 1837, 18 years old, small in stature, already possessing an absolute certainty about her own authority. She reigned for 63 years. She outlived her husband by 40 years. She ruled over an empire that covered a fifth of the world's land surface, and she wrote in her journal almost every day of her life, filling volume after volume with her observations, her emotions, her judgments. And then, in 1952, a young woman stood on a balcony at Buckingham Palace and became, for the second time in history, a queen named Elizabeth. Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years, the longest reign of any British monarch in recorded history. She navigated the dissolution of empire, the transformation of the Commonwealth, the reinvention of monarchy in a media age. She gave her first television broadcast in 1957, her first Christmas message in 1952, and her final public engagement just 2 days before she died, in September 2022. 7 women, across 9 centuries, each of them operating within systems designed by and for men, each of them finding different ways to assert authority, survive scrutiny, manage power, and leave something behind. What changed across those 9 centuries is significant. The laws, the expectations, the medical knowledge that might have saved Mary's pregnancies or Anne's children. What the vote means, what education means, what public life means. But look closely at what did not change. The way each of these women had to justify their right to be in the room. The way their appearance was always a political statement. The way their bodies were always, in some sense, considered public property. The way they were admired or feared in proportion to how much they resembled the men who came before them. Matilda was praised for having the heart of a man. Elizabeth I claimed the stomach of a king. Even their most celebrated qualities were borrowed from the masculine vocabulary of power, because no other vocabulary had yet been invented. Perhaps that is the real through line. Not the crown, not the throne, not the centuries. It is the persistent, exhausting, creative work of women who kept finding ways to be powerful in languages that were not built for them. If there is another place and time in women's history you would like to step inside, a city, a century, a life, leave it in the comments. These stories are not finished.